Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. We're going to resume our event. So I kindly ask you to take a seat.
A punto de colarme, ¿no?
Tú estás
ahora bien
aquí.
está.
Eso es, ahora bien está. Son las 3. Sí, son...
So as I was pointing out to Íñigo Méndez de Vigo, we have the previous roundtable that starts at 3. And we're going to be talking about Christian churches in European integration and their response to secularization with Monsignor Mariano Crociata, who's the president of COMECE, Tomas Halik, professor of Charles University Prague, Manuel Barrios, secretary general of COMECE, Alfredo Abad, president of the Spanish Evangelical Church, and we're going to have Rafael Vázquez, who's the secretary for Interconfessional Relations of the Spanish Bishops' Conference, as a moderator. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to continue with this reflection day along this morning. We've been reflecting about the integration process in Europe that started after the dramatic experience of the two world wars, that started a path of reconciliation that excluded consideration of those events from the perspective of rivalry, humiliation, the politicians after the war, De Gasperi, Eisenhower, and so forth. Some of them are being beatified today, as it's the case of Schuman and De Gasperi, who are considered the founding fathers of Europe, and they were capable to turn a collaboration and mutual exchange and exchange of knowledge and friendship in differences come true. And thanks to this effort, Europe has experienced a long period of peace that has been unprecedented. This reconciliation and unity of European countries wasn't only based on some strategies of political, economic, industrial, cultural integration, but it was also inspired by some moral values that are rooted in Christianity that establish the basis for a recognition of people, of their dignity, for peace, and their citizen responsibility. We've been reflecting about these issues all this morning. We've been reflecting about citizenship participation and the founding values of the EU. One of the keys for identity in current Europe that is configured as a multi-ethnic, multicultural society has been the separation between faith and law, church and the state, thus overcoming the Middle Age concept of Christianity. And this has been considered a step forward. However, the emancipation from reason and faith and the consideration of science as an objective kind of knowledge and faith as a mere subjective belief took us to consider some sort of secular rationality, thus cornering religion to the private sphere. And this is the way our societies have evolved in what we called an anthropology without God and without Jesus, that places man at the very center of reality. European culture appears to be experiencing a silent apostasy by self-sufficient men that live as if God did not exist. Within this secularization process in Europe, we have framed these reflections we've been having this morning and will be having this afternoon, because Christian churches need to respond to this challenge of secularization. So within this Europe that is plural, not only in culture but also religious terms, how can different Christian confessions contribute in order to provide Europe with a soul, something we've been talking about all this morning? Or how can faith and the gospel actively participate in the integration process of Europe? And how can they become a cohesive element? Using an image put forward by Pope Francis, the music of the gospel needs to keep on vibrating within the roots of Europe. And these are going to be the issues covered by Monsignor Mariano Crociata, the Bishop of Latina, Terracina, Sezze, Triverno, who since March 2023 is the president of the Commission of the Bishop Conferences of the EU, the COMECE. And we're going to have comments by Monsignor Tomas Halik, who's here on screen, who is a professor of sociology at the Charles University in Prague. He's the president of the Czech Christian Academy, and he is an advisor on dialogue with non-believers. Then we'll have Reverend Manuel Barrios, who is a priest of the Diocese of Madrid, where he took on the position of being the delegate of ecumenism and interreligious dialogue. He was also the director of the Commission for Interconfessional Relationships of the Episcopal Conference of Spain, and who I succeeded to in that position. And then last but not least, we'll have comments by the current secretary of COMECE, Manuel Barrios, and then we have Alfredo Abad, the president of the Spanish Evangelical Church in Spain, who plays an active role both in ecumenism at both national, international, and European level. Before I leave the floor to Monsignor Crociata, I would like to remind our audience, both here as the audience that is following our discussions online, that you can answer your questions through WhatsApp by connecting to the number 659-043-284 with the code 34 if you're calling from or texting from abroad. And without further ado, Mr. Crociata, the floor is yours. Thank you for the presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank you for your invitation. Along the morning, I've seen a growing gratitude for being able to share such a significant experience with all of you. So I'd like to thank the Paul VI Foundation and Institute. The topic of this afternoon has three pillars: Christian churches, European integration, and secularization. Or I would say, in the order in which I'd like to approach them: European integration, secularization, and Christian churches. When it comes to European integration, well, I wouldn't have much to add after the fruitful debate we had this morning, because it was deeply developed by the previous speakers. I would simply say, in this regard, that European integration refers to the idea of something that is being developed, that European integration dates back to the historical beginnings and the current reality of the European Union. The European Union wasn't thought as something definite, and the need of a growth and development process was actually part of the project itself from its very inception. And when it comes to current times, I would say that this integration process is being pushed, it's being considered necessary by the project itself due to the de facto characteristics and the most hostile characteristics that can be envisioned, since everything from the culture of individual rights without any duties involved. When we're talking about consumerism, that it's almost like a new religion, consumerism not only of things but of people as well, with the pervasiveness of social media, everything seems to come together in order to disincentivize any integration process in the social dynamic before the political dynamic, both at local as at global levels. In the global level, we can see how the ongoing wars have an incredible impact on such process.
The integration process is fed by a social and cultural fabric composed of values. And it is precisely this what really is lacking these days, or in other words, it is lacking the fact that it is not shared, and that means that we are really far away from capturing the signs or the real opinions of the public opinion, or rather, as it was said this morning, European citizenship. Therefore, public opinions have been sequestered, so to speak, by international political questions, and in these days, political issues, or what we see of political issues, is evident or becomes more and more evident every day, especially in relation to electoral campaigns. And in relation to this, Christians have been protagonists of the European adventure. However, at the beginning, what started as a cultural and moral fabric, something important, an important factor at the time, or a solidarity, and very, very much rooted in the social fabric where churches did have a significant and crucial role, has become a mere recall, a mere memory. So we are witnessing a fundamental change that started first in the 70s, and very much in this process has to do the process of secularization. Just let me give you a figure which is important for the interpretation of this phenomenon. The concept of secularization is very complex in itself in terms of definition, but we can witness that the cultural process in which we are immersed shows that the relationships between society and religion have changed dramatically within the context of the European Union and the community, European community. So we are witnessing a larger gap between religion and society. There are many theoretical proposals that have aimed at understanding and analyzing this change, and they have been faced with a hermeneutic difficulty, in the sense that the categories for analysis used have been secular, non-secular, hermeneutical, and non-hermeneutical, religious and non-religious. So in all these categories, we can see a fragmentation of the signals. Just in the words of Zygmunt Bauman, we can see a fluidity. So we lack the roots. We have strong points, anchoring points, so that we can continue with our analysis and interpretation of the phenomenon. Within this moving universe, we can find some elements that can help us understanding this phenomenon. We have seen how Christianity has evolved from the medieval times. It has gone through an evolution, reaching to a nationalization, so to speak, of the religion, up to the point where we can see a divide between the church and the state, showing then the first signal of secularization. According to Niklas Luhmann, religion and politics and other human activities such as economy, justice, science, together with others, have gone through this process. Religion has no longer an influence on the other sectors, in the sense that all of them do have their own autonomy. They play independently, so they all have their own reason for being, they all have their interpretation criteria. Charles Taylor pointed out to the radical change in this regard, consisting of a world where religion or having a faith or being a believer was something that was taken for granted. It was natural believing in something. Being a believer was something natural, whereas these days what is natural and what is normal is being a non-believer. Not having a belief, not having a faith, not having a religion. And this has become a choice among many others. And also, there are other scholars such as Duchal who coincide in this analysis and see secularization as the extreme point of religions, among them Christianity. So we can see how many scholars do have an articulate thinking regarding secularization. However, regarding all the different theories, we can say that secularization is not the end of history. Secularization can be seen as a process, as a part of a process, meaning that Christianity has been and will continue being the chosen reality in the sense of religion, in the sense that it can be chosen by the individuals. The subject, the individual, decides to opt for a religion or opt for some elements of specific religion, or chooses among different available religions. So in this manner, a new space is open up, positive space, in the sense that it is a mature and conscientious space based on a personal choice, although sometimes
tradizionale o nel modo
although sometimes arbitrary. It is an individual manner of approaching religion, and it also has to do with the way of practicing religion, which is highly influenced by the environment, the personal or individual environment. this has much to do with the delegitimization of institutions. All these aspects are integral part of the social situation and of the ecclesiastical situation. So we can see that some religions are in some way standardized in terms of the religious elements and of the public opinion. And also, on the other hand, we can see that some people have taken a distance from the official religion, however, persecute a spiritual growth and a spiritual path. We also need to add to this context that the contemporaneity has got a fictional character in the sense that we can find different views of religion which are contradictory in themselves, in the sense that some people attend church just as if they were living 50 years ago, so to speak. Also, the traditional religion perpetuates a model that, although trying to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ and the sacraments and the rites of the church, do not always manage to reach the present citizens, the citizens of today, because they find it difficult to interpret religion outside the standard religious criteria, and do not have an impact, or sometimes not even an impact at all, on practitioners, on religion practitioners or believers. So the question now is, how do churches position themselves towards this situation, fighting against an all-pervasive secularization becomes something extremely difficult and complex, in the sense that the cultural change is irreversible, and we are talking about a very complex process where churches are active actors, although not the only and main actors. In this sense, it would be useful to read the parable of the cross in relation to modernity. Then we would understand that all the attempts to govern the process of going away from Christianity, in the words of Marcel Goursain and Mylène Poulain, have failed. Pietro Scopola, a historian from Italy, referred to the new Christianity, the new lost Christianity, referring to new pastoral and ecclesial projects. And he stated, or he used the word end, the end, just like a way of witnessing the contemporary world. This is not an easy task, taking into consideration the eruption of technology and technical development in society, having artificial intelligence as the last technological advancement, and also take into consideration that societies have become more and more plural, not only from the religious viewpoint. That means that sometimes there is a loss of hope, there is a lack of hope at different levels, also very much influenced by the geopolitics and the financial and all-pervasive influence. an invasive influence onto society. And so we can make an analogy, interesting analogy with the European Union in relation to Christian churches, although we are talking about two different levels. We can use this so as to understand that these two entities do actually need to recognize and do need to take the option of helping each other in a more collaborative manner. So, suspicion should stop, should arrive, should put an end to nostalgia and should put an end to the old times and to thinking that the old times are better than the present ones. Christian churches should not be seen as a residue of fear and as a residue of bad times coming from the past, and increasing belonging to the European Union and a strengthening of the concept of European citizenship would be very beneficial, so as to counteract the nationalist pulsions and national impetus from the member states that are really an obstacle at the different levels: local, regional, national. Therefore, Christian churches need to understand that although different, the historic and institutional task cannot be separated from the pastoral task and from the spiritual task. The civil dialogue and the pastoral dialogue must be established with the civic society, so that the social principles of the church are shaped in society, so that the individuals do have an operational instrument to relate themselves with the church. I'm referring here to the work of some institutions such as the COMECE and the European churches, such as, for instance, the Protestant Church, have the task ahead of carrying out, establishing a dialogue with European institutions, just as laid down at Article 17 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, so as to establish long and coherent relations between institutions. In this case, COMECE, through its relations with the Holy See and the European institutions. So these bodies are in charge of establishing dialogue and maintaining that dialogue, so as to keep the commitment of ecclesial communities at all different levels. So we are talking about a link aimed at the same objective, although all of them do show different ways of thinking. And as part of that thinking, Christians shape and constitute in their own manners part of the civic society. This constitutes a responsibility on all Christians, to all Christians. In this manner, we are dealing with an ecclesial question, and this is why there should be an intermediate dialogue that facilitates the dialogue and the relationships between the local and the European levels. That is, the dialogue between the churches, local churches, and the different countries of the European Union. It would be a dialogue that would show a link between the civil society and the member states. So this intermediate level would be like a loudspeaker of the voices coming from the community. This would also be a way of counteracting populism and nationalism. And I would like to quote Oliveira Juan in his interpretation of this phenomenon. He uses religious symbols and religious references beyond the ecclesial nature, with the effect of a substantial secularization that goes beyond religion, in the sense that the values and the ethics of religious symbols is absolutely individualistic and consumer-oriented. Hergé would talk about structurization, and so this would just constitute an illusion in relation to religion symbols. Unfortunately, many believers do not agree with this, especially those who are looking for symbols and for security and for safety in the midst of a contemporary and modern world where they see themselves defenseless, and where they see that the world that was before us in the past is about to disappear. And this is common to all Christian churches. Churches are waiting for the arrival of the kingdom of God, and therefore they are also expecting for that objective to be met, and when this happens, the end would be fulfilled. This is linked to a discussion that took place some years ago in relation to the faith, to Christian faith, that is more and more limited to the civic scope, to the civic sphere, because of historical reasons. And this debate, although valid, still valid for Christian churches, it is usually accompanied by some cultural values that do have a Christian origin. We cannot deny that many of the values enshrined in the Charter of European Fundamental Values do have a correspondence in the social doctrine, social Catholic doctrine, and is related to the original conception of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. This is important in a moment when the minority of believers is evident. The number of followers decreases, and although Christianity is still there, it coexists these days with multiple religions. Nevertheless, Christianity continues playing a fundamental role, and the Christian tradition has always rejected any possible type of sectarism. Also, there are biblical historical facts that state and that show that the disciples were always accompanied by a small number, and that the believers or individuals looking for Jesus eventually find Jesus and find guidance and find their path. So in this manner, the faith has always been there, and faith has always encountered everyone, those believers, those wanting and waiting and hoping for an answer, for a response. And this is a fundamental legacy into the Christian church and onto the European process of integration from a Christian viewpoint. Thank you very much, Monsignor Crociata, for your interesting presentation. Now I would like to give the floor to Professor Tomas Halik. Can you hear me, Professor Halik? Sí, sí.
And you hear me? So, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I see my face on the large screen at the stage. It looks like George Orwell's Big Brother is watching you. But I'm not Big Brother, I'm just Little Brother, and with a short comment. This is a story of secular culture and its relationship to Christianity. As has been said, is very complicated and full of changes. Secular culture can be described as a byproduct of Christianity. There are still disputes about whether the laicity is a legitimate heritage of Christianity or whether it is a Christian heresy, whether it is an unwanted child of the church or a prodigal son to be welcomed with open arms. The distinction between secular power and ecclesiastical authority, which we find already in Pope Gelasius, was sharpened during the disputes between the papacy and the empire over investiture, and had far-reaching ecclesiological, but also political and cultural consequences. In this dispute, the Church is established as a separate religious institution, distinct from the state and nationality. Nothing like that is in Judaism or Islam. And thus, as a unique phenomenon in the history of religion, and at the same time, a sphere of laicity, a secular culture, is created. For several centuries, until the Enlightenment, both spheres live a relationship of mutual dialectic, of polarity, and compatibility. Their mutual relationship is the basis of the plurality and dynamism of Western civilization and an important chapter in the history of political and spiritual freedom in the West. Such a clear distinction has never been made in Eastern Christianity, and Byzantine Caesaropapism has its heritage in Russia, from the Tsarist rule through Marx-Leninism as a state religion of the Soviet Empire, to today's unity of throne and altar in the non-holy alliance of Putin's terrorist state with the nationalist ideology of the fundamentalist Russian Orthodox Church. From the Enlightenment throughout modernity, this child of Western Christianity has undergone a process of emancipation. The Church is anxious and sometimes hostile response to this process, especially to the scientific, cultural, social, and political revolutions of late modernity, has contributed to mutual alienation and sometimes hostility on the European continent. If the Church was driven by nostalgia for the medieval Christianitas in these culture wars in Europe, it was bound to lose. The result was secularization in the form of exculturation of the Christian faith. Christianity lost its form of religion in Europe, religion in the sense of religare, to reunite. Its role of an integrating force for the whole society and the common language. Other phenomena gradually aspired to this role of religion, of the common language. It was culture in Romanticism, science in modernity, political religions, fascism, communism, Nazism, and also the media were religion in the sense of interpreting the war and offering some common symbols and stories. Or today, the capitalist market economics. Religion became just one sector of the life of individuals and society, one sector along the other sectors. Christianity had a somewhat different development in Britain and especially in the United States, where the Church did not go through the trauma of the terror of the French Revolution, where the Enlightenment did not have the atheistic feature like in France, and the Church learned to live in a free, democratic, pluralistic society. This experience contributed to the turn of the Catholic Church in relation to modernity and secularity at the Second Vatican Council, to the turn from confrontation to dialogue. Paul VI, in Apostolic Exhortation Evangelii Nuntiandi, declared secularization to be the effort in itself just and legitimate and in no way incompatible with faith or religion to discover the law governing reality and human life implanted by Creator. Pope Francis commented on this exhortation of Paul VI in his address to the priest in Quebec in 2022. I quote, "God does not want us to be slaves, but sons and daughters. He does not want to make decisions for us or oppress us with sacred power exercised in a world governed by religious laws. No, he created us to be free and asked us to be mature and responsible persons in life and society." So Pope Francis. The Pope Francis emphasized the difference between secularization and secularism. Secularism as an ideological interpretation of the phenomenon that leads to various forms of new atheism in lifestyle. Pope Francis added, as church, it is up to us to make these distinctions, to make this discernment. If we yield to negative view and judge matters superficially, we risk sending the wrong message, as those the criticism of secularization masks, on our part, the nostalgia for the sacralized world, a bygone society in which the Church and her ministers had greater power and social relevance. And this is a mistaken way of seeing this. So Pope Francis. Pope Benedict spoke similarly about the relationship between secularity and faith. I quote from his remarks during a trip to Portugal in 2010. Then were always individuals who thought to build bridges and create a dialogue, but unfortunately, the prevailing tendency was one of opposition and mutual exclusion. Today, we see that this very dialectic represents an opportunity and that we need to develop a synthesis and forward-looking and profound dialogue. End of quotation. I'm convinced that the process of synodal renewal of the Church, which is now underway, and which subscribe the concept of the Church as a common way, syn rhodos, can mark a new stage in the history of Christianity, a journey from confessionally closed Catholicism to through Catholicity, universality, and ecumenicity. Some Christians fear that Christianity may lose its identity on the road to universal brotherhood. I, on the other hand, believe that this is a real opportunity to understand the identity of Christianity in a new and deeper way. This, of course, requires a deepening of Christian theology and spirituality. That, however, is a topic beyond the scope of this paper. But I hope in this process of synodality, we discover a new ways of this dialogue between the secular culture and Christian faith, and new way to be Christians in our world. And I think it's really a prophetic and very important initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Halik. And After this tension you've showed us between secularization and Christian culture, Tomas Halik, I'm going to give the floor to Don Manuel Barrios, who's going to take the stage. Can you hear me? Well, I wonder if this other microphone interferes. Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate. I've worked a lot in the Madrid diocese, so I'm very pleased with the news of these new auxiliary bishops for the Archdiocese of Madrid. So I'd like to congratulate them. And I'm going to join them in prayer. I know one of them very well. He was the rector of the diocesan seminar. Monsignor Halik,
And I'm very pleased to see you again virtually. We met last week physically in Mons in Poland, in our plenary assembly of COMECE. So it's very nice to have you here and also to hear how you go beyond a bit what you told to the bishops in this paper that you presented today. So thank you very much. Anche è un piacere stare con Don Mariano, il mio capo.
It's a pleasure to be here with Don Mariano, who's my boss, and with all of you who've come from Italy. I'm going to be speaking in Spanish. I would like to thank our interpreters for the work. My contribution is going to be quite short because I think a lot has been said already by Mr. Crociata and the theologian Halik. With Professor Halik, I've talked several times. I had a very nice experience when we had dinner a few months ago in Brussels. And he had just published a book called The Afternoon of Christianity. I wonder if some of you have read it already. It's a very interesting book that takes up the metaphor of those ages of human beings as defined by Carl Jung, and it's applied to Christianity and the situation of Christianity right now. And he was last week in Łomża in Poland, where we had the plenary assembly of the COMECE, to the European Conference of Episcopal Conferences. And it was a very important moment for European bishops, for all of us, because we held this assembly in a place that became part of the EU some 20 years ago, on the 1st of May 2004. This is something that was mentioned this morning. And our intention to hold this plenary assembly in Poland was to listen. This is another word that we've mentioned here on several occasions. We wanted to listen the voice of the Church and of the Central and Eastern European countries. I believe that this is a very important topic in our current EU. We need to learn how to listen to one another. And as Professor Leons was saying this morning, we need to be able to see things from one another's perspective. Sometimes we use labels, and sometimes we use some barriers in inappropriate manners. And we accuse others of not being worthy of being listened to. And sometimes that happens within the Church as well. So I'm going to mention two aspects that are mentioned in the title of this roundtable. The first one is European integration, and then the work of the COMECE. So since I'm part of this institution, I'm going to promote it, and I'm going to tell you what we do. So as the official presentation of the Catholic Church of member states at European institutions. First of all, I'm going to talk briefly about the secularization process, because a lot has been said already, and the response that we can provide from the Church, or from the different churches, the Catholic Church, but also other churches, when it comes to this phenomenon in Europe nowadays. So first of all, European integration. We know that the process of European integration had a strong boost some 70 years ago. We're talking about a significant boost, because maybe the process started a long further ago. That was on the 9th of May 1950, which is often indicated as the starting date due to the famous speech by Robert Schuman. So it's a new boost that took place after the terrible wars that ravaged our continent in the last century, causing much destruction, death, and suffering. It was a very brave project, and we have an author who speaks about a jump into the void. It was a brave proposal by Robert Schuman, and it aimed at guaranteeing peace by making war impossible. And this, maybe in the current context of so much uncertainty and tension and ongoing wars within our continent and very near to us, well, it takes a different sense of urgency. I believe that we need to become aware of the fact that we cannot take peace for granted. This is a project that involves, first of all, an economic aspect, to remove control of the materials necessary for war so that we can prevent war. So it's a practical sense of solidarity, which is a fundamental concept, in my opinion. And I believe that it's a concept that we need to oppose to the concept of ideological imposition, practical solidarity, which prevents war because nobody has control over the necessary materials. The European Union, as a union of different countries within an entity, is more than a simple association of independent countries. It is something unique that exists only in the European Union. And that is why we can understand the existence of my institution as an ecclesial organization that wants to keep company to this integration process and wants to contribute to it. And this is the purpose of our institution. As Christians, we believe that the founding fathers of the European Union, when proposing this project, were inspired by their Christian culture and by the communitarian personalism, as was mentioned this morning, by Christian thinkers and philosophers. And I think that we need to add as well, in the case of many of them, by their faith, because their faith led them to take further steps of reconciliation, to stretch their hands and arms, and to think out of the box, as we say in Brussels these days. And the Church has taken part in this process from its inception. More than 50 years ago, a nunciature at the European Union was created. It was different from the one that existed for the Kingdom of Belgium and Luxembourg in order to have diplomatic relationships between the Holy See and the European Union. And some more than 40 years ago, in 1980, my institution, the COMECE, was created as an official representation of the Church at member states, at European institutions, with the purpose to have a dialogue with institutions that is nowadays backed by the Union treaties. In fact, Article 17, that was mentioned this morning as well, establishes the obligation of the Union to have an open dialogue, a transparent, a regular dialogue with the Church, with religious organizations and philosophical and non-confessional organizations. And this article of the treaty can be perceived as the result, you might like it or not, but as the result, the very result of all of those debates we had about the invocatio days, about the naming of God in the Constitution, about the need to refer to Christian roots in the funding texts or not. And I believe as well, and this maybe would give rise to a thesis or an end of a degree dissertation, this Article 17 can be perceived as a way to regulate the relationships between religious confessions and civil institutions in this postmodern era. It's funny that in the treaties of the Union, we have an article like this that calls for a dialogue between the European Union and the Church and religious and confessional institutions. COMECE has a governing body that is integrated by the bishops of Episcopal churches of the European Union and a secretariat with a seat in Brussels, in which we cover the different sectors of EU interests that are of interest to the Church. In the coming European elections, we have published a work document for dialogue with political parties and candidates, in which we review our priorities as a Church for these elections. So which are these issues? Which are those issues that are prioritary issues for us and that should be part of the political parties by different parties? Let me just quote a very short text. Some of these priorities to us are the rule of law and democracy, the fundamental rights, laws on families and defense of life, war and peace, social justice, fight against poverty, digitalization, artificial intelligence, the care for a common household, migration, asylum, and the extension of the EU. These are topics that we believe should be prioritized. I wouldn't like to delve too long into these issues, but I would like to say something with regard to the last issue that I have mentioned, which is the extension of the EU, that with wars ravaging in our continent and in the Holy Land is a very current topic. It's something that we are talking about once again, this petition of extension of the EU to include different countries in the Balkans and in the east of Europe. In order to be brief, and if you allow me to, I would like to add that we had this plenary assembly in Poland last week, as I said before, with this idea as well to celebrate these 20 years of this historical extension of the EU that took place in 2004, where we had other member states coming in and another one leaving the Union. 2004, we have Cyprus, Malta, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania. And I'm going to read the short statement by the bishops of my institution that we agreed upon in Mons in Poland last week on Friday, and that we published yesterday about how we perceive this process of extension of the EU from the church perspective, because it's related to the title of today's debate. So what is our opinion as a church of European integration? What can we say about this wish by many countries to be part of our union? Well, let me just read this statement by bishops. It's brief, but I believe it can give us an idea of how the Church perceives this European integration process, this extension of the Union. It's available in several languages. It can be easily tracked or found on the internet. And I quote, "Us, the delegate bishops of the bishop conferences of the EU, gathered for the plenary assembly for the spring of 2024 in Łomża, Poland, in order to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the historical extension of the EU, have adopted the following statement. The Catholic Church has kept close company to the process of European integration from its inception, since it considers it a process of union for the countries in Europe that are together in a community in order to guarantee peace, freedom, democracy, the rule of law, respect of human rights, and prosperity. This process, bravely boosted by the founding fathers of the EU after terrible wars that took place in our continent, was also based on Christian values, such as the recognition of the dignity of human beings, subsidiarity, solidarity, and the search for common good. The 1st of May 2004, the EU included 10 new member states, and this was a significant step towards the realization of a vision of a united Europe that could breathe with its two lungs, as was imagined by our Holy Father John Paul II. By uniting Western and Eastern Europe in a community of diverse peoples that are united nonetheless by a common history and destiny. This was a milestone in the Europeization of the EU, so that it becomes closer to what it's called to be, a powerful testament to our times of how fraternal cooperation for the search of peace that is rooted in shared values can prevail over conflicts and divisions. However, a larger union, but a more diverse union, has also brought new challenges. Despite a solid political and economic integration of member states in the EU, it's debatable the extent up to which we've had an authentic dialogue in European societies among different cultures, realities, and national identities. If we don't have a truly European spirit that includes a sense of belonging to the same community and a shared sense of responsibility, the trust within the EU can be diminished, and the construction of unity can be compromised by attempts to place particular interests above the common good. After the crisis over the last years that has caused a certain fatigue, the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine and the geopolitical events in our neighboring countries have created a new boost for future incorporations into the EU, particularly when it comes to the countries in the Balkans and in the east of Europe. Beyond being a geopolitical need for the stability of our continent, we consider the perspective of a future extension of the EU as a strong message for hope for the citizens of candidate countries and as a response to their wish to live in peace and justice. We cannot forget that these countries have had to endure terrible difficulties and sacrifices along the way. The adhesion to EU is a bidirectional process nonetheless. The countries that want to become members to the EU in the future, they need to keep on applying the structural reforms in some crucial areas, particularly when it comes to the areas of the rule of law, the strengthening of democratic institutions, the fundamental rights, including religious freedom and freedom for media, together with fight against corruption and organized crime. At the same time, a credible process to integrate the EU should adequately respond to these reform efforts by avoiding any double standards when it comes to considering the candidate countries. The credibility of the process to create the EU implies some concrete measures by the EU in order to be ready to receive new members. The future extension of the EU, it's an opportunity to update the idea of a united Europe based on practical solidarity and in order to rediscover the creative fidelity to those great ideals that inspired its foundation. An extended EU will have to rethink its forms of governance to allow its members and its institutions to act fast and efficiently. In addition, any adjustment of the budgetary frameworks of policies of cooperation areas need to take into account their impact on people, particularly on the most vulnerable members of these member states. In the hope for this process to keep on going forward, we also feel the need to urge for a deeper reflection about our common values and the links that we have as a European family. As Pope Francis said in his speech in March 2023, Europe has a future if it implies an actual union that values unity within diversity. The principles of subsidiarity, respect for different traditions and cultures that create Europe, and its commitment to continue its way along the path of practical solidarity are fundamental. As a Catholic Church, we are willing to contribute with these efforts. The story of the integration of Europe is still to be written, and therefore we urge our Jesus Christ, with the intersection of Virgin Mary and the patrons of Europe, Saint Benedict, Saint Brigida, Saint Catherine of Siena, and Saint Teresa, to intercede in order to help this process. And this is the statement that we signed in Poland in April 2024. I wanted to read it because I think it gives you an idea of the debate we had as bishops in the plenary about this topic. And in this assembly that we held in Poland, we could hear different voices. Excellent. If you can wrap up. So we heard different opinions, and we realized that there is still a lot to talk about. And I love this insistence by Professor Leonce on the importance of dialogue. I had some other things to say about secularization, but I'm going to wrap up, and I'm going to give the floor to my friend, Mr. Abad. I'm so sorry. I forced you to wrap up, but otherwise we won't give enough time to our brother to talk. So please go ahead. Well, I'm going to speak in concrete terms, and I'm going to leave some time for questions. I'd like to start with a story. The process of building the EU, we had a pastor from France, Jean Benomino, that said that In its inceptions, the EU was created by the mothers of French and German victims of the Civil War and could cross the border to meet the mothers of those that had killed their children, of their enemies. And that process of reconciliation by those mothers and those grandmothers, and I'm talking about this pastor that had particularly working Alsace, that was a particularly sensitive territory to this process, and he saw in this movement an engine, the engine of reconciliation as being a founding element to the union. But today we're talking about secularization. Have like a heterodoxical sort of participation here, and that's what I'm going to do. We're talking about secularization, but we have the presence of Russia that is actually advocating for the invasion of Russia. We have different positions regarding what Hamas has done with the massacre over the Israeli settlements, on the genocide that is perpetrating Israel on Gaza. And when we translate that, we only translate it to religious conflicts. And we don't consider the economic, political part, but we qualify certain factions as pro-Israeli, pro-Jew, pro-Islam. And we're talking about secularization and the problem of secularization when actually we are the problem, we ourselves. I remember that in 2015, I did a visit in Hungary when they were closing the borders to Syrian refugees that would leave the country en masse in order to arrive in Europe. And the worst speeches came from the Reformed Catholic or bishops that were giving arguments for the closing of the borders. So we are on the side of what can build Europe, but sometimes we're on the side of what can deconstruct Europe as well. And that's why I believe that secularization is not only a threat, but can also be an opportunity for neutrality and for guarantees. And here, my friend Manuel Barrios, he mentioned again the Article 17 of the Treaty of the Union, but as was mentioned before, I believe that that's our position, but it's also our position to take into account the preamble of the Treaty of Lisbon and Article 2 that is a lot more powerful when it comes to values. Because when we look at Article 17 and the function of the EU, who is in charge of it? Well, it's the Osmar Karas, the Austrian politician. And when you enter the website, the only thing that Warkaras has done is to have different dialogues with all of the different institutions, but his contributions are technical and have nothing to do with the religious freedom problems that there are in Europe, with the problems of the lack of equality, with the problems of how the EU migration and asylum pact is being managed. So we need to decide, and this is something that I'm going to link to what I was saying to Manuel Barrios, with the issue that if we delve into the sense of what makes Europe, then we're going to gain in terms of democracy. Of what we're going to do is that we're going to extend the EU at any price, which is going to come at a very high cost because of the complexity of the different territories within our region. And part of delving into these issues is to talk from an institutional point of view that we have approach from religious institutions. We lack a full participation. We've only participated in certain articles that are more related to an institutional diplomacy with philosophical and religious institutions. And we need to reclaim, I believe, a deeper reflection about decisions, and we need to leave this role. Why? Because we have structures, and I'm going to talk about my own institution first, because if the scheme by the European Union is a scheme that considers states, we do not have a more ordained and organized presence in Europe. The last ecumenical assembly in Europe of 2021, the last charter, it dates back from a decade ago. And we're competing with other institutions that have a lot heavier presence in other states because there are platforms, but they don't have a single spokesperson. And each religious institution have their presence in Brussels. They all have their offices in Brussels. But Jean Memino was saying that the credibility of dialogue that churches can have with European institutions needs to be articulated from a joint voice. And I believe that it has to take place more than in Strasbourg or than in the on the Human Rights Court than in Brussels, because at the Commission institutions we work already from a technical point of view. If we need to fight the European Migration Pact, we have Caritas, the European Council for Refugees, our own Protestant or Orthodox institutions, and they all fight together. And of course, in our institution, we constantly sign joint documents so that we can work in favor of what's going to be social cohesion in Europe. I believe that we need to be faithful to the slogan by Jacques Delors, because Jacques Delors said that we need to bring Europe, we need to provide Europe with a heart and soul.
And he said that from the following perspective. We can help to the construction of Europe from the following viewpoint. You have to speak every week among you. You have to transmit others the need that Europe has of having a heart and a soul, so that they do not follow fanaticism, so that they do not follow confrontation, that they are an integral part in the construction, in the building of Europe, because they are the citizens that will change and that will shape the future of Europe. So providing them with an opportunity is similar to the opportunity that secularism and secularization provides to this process. And this is linked to social cohesion. We feel really ashamed when we see the content of the Pact for Asylum and Migration, where we see clear limitations on the free movement of people due to religious persecution. So this is in contradiction with Article 17 of the treaty. So I think we should take a stand there so as not to take a low profile in such an important question. And Pope Francis said it in his encyclical, in 80th Hensis encyclical. He was attacking Marxism that encyclical, although not positioning himself towards Marxism or towards liberalism, rather. Thank you very much.
Bueno, pues agradezco todas las intervenciones.
Thank you very much for your presentations. Thank you very much for showing so many perspectives and viewpoints in relation to the question of the European integration. I don't know if there are any questions, obviously not because a lack of interest. Your presentations have been extremely interesting, as I was saying. I would like to put an end here to this session, And once again, thank you so much for your enriching speeches and for establishing a dialogue so engaging to all of us. So thank you very much again.